But to truly understand this conflict, we must go beyond the headlines and step into the pages of Scripture. The land in question, what the Bible calls the Promised Land, was given by God to Abraham and his descendants. This divine covenant, recorded in Genesis, is not just a historical footnote. It's a spiritual anchor that continues to shape the identity and destiny of nations. Yet, from the moment that promise was spoken, a spiritual resistance began. The descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, two lines, two nations, each believing they have a rightful claim. This isn't just a political disagreement. It's a clash of spiritual inheritance, one rooted in God's promise, the other fueled by rivalry, rejection, and centuries of unresolved pain. The prophets foretold these tensions in Zechariah. We're warned that Jerusalem will become a cup of trembling for all nations. In Ezekiel, we see nations aligning for war in the final days. What we're witnessing today could very well be echoes of those ancient words coming to life. This is why Christians cannot view this conflict as just another geopolitical crisis. We are watching prophecy unfold, perhaps even stepping into the birth pangs of the end times. But with that comes a calling not to choose sides politically, but to pray fervently, seek God's wisdom, and stand on the truth of His Word. To understand where it all began, we must go way back to the book of Genesis. It starts with a promise God made to Abraham, a covenant that his descendants would inherit a land, a name, and a blessing that would ripple through generations. But the promise also introduced a spiritual divide. Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. While Isaac was the child of promise, Ishmael too became the father of a great nation. And from that moment, a seed of tension was planted, one that would grow into the conflict we see today. As we trace this divide through the Old Testament, we encounter prophetic warnings, divine judgments, and a constant struggle for identity, land, and legitimacy. Jerusalem, the heart of this struggle, is not just another city. It's the city God chose for His name to dwell, the place where heaven touched earth. But that also makes it a battleground in the unseen realm, contested not only by earthly powers, but by spiritual forces. Fast forward to today, and the headlines may change, but the core issue remains the same. Borders may shift, governments may rise and fall, peace talks may come and go, but the ancient tension rooted in God's promises and man's rebellion continues to burn. In this series, we'll explore how prophecy, history, and modern politics are all woven together into one grand narrative. A narrative that not only explains the past, but may reveal where we're headed next. So grab your Bible, open your heart, and let's journey through the spiritual layers behind the Israel-Palestine conflict like never before. According to the Bible, Isaac was the son of promise born to Sarah through a miraculous act of God. It was through Isaac that the covenant would continue, eventually leading to Jacob, later named Israel, and the 12 tribes that would become the nation of Israel. But Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn through Hagar, was not forgotten. God also blessed him, promising that he would become a great nation. And indeed, from Ishmael came many Arab peoples. This is where the tension begins. Two sons, two destinies, both claiming a connection to the same promise. From a spiritual perspective, it wasn't just a family dispute. It was a foreshadowing of the centuries-long conflict between nations, beliefs, and identities. The Bible tells us that this division would not be easily resolved. In Genesis 16:12, Ishmael is described as a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. That prophetic word wasn't just about Ishmael's life. It was a glimpse into the generations of tension that would follow. And so, what began as a household struggle over inheritance and divine favor has grown into one of the most complex conflicts in human history. But while politics and territory dominate the headlines, the spiritual undercurrent, rooted in ancient promises, prophetic words, and divine purpose, continues to drive this age-old enmity. Stay with us as we uncover how these biblical foundations still echo in today's world, and what they reveal about the future unfolding before our eyes. Abraham had two sons, Ishmael, born to Hagar, an Egyptian slave, and Isaac, born to his wife, Sarah, in their old age. According to the Bible, God's covenant would be passed through Isaac and his descendants, making Isaac the father of Jacob, whose descendants became the Israelites. This divine promise of land and blessing to Isaac and his descendants is central to the Jewish claim to the land of Israel, Genesis 17:19-21. But Ishmael also received a blessing from God. In Genesis 16:10-12, God promised that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation. Ishmael's descendants are traditionally understood to be the Arab people, which includes the Palestinians. This ancestral division sets the stage for the conflict, as both Jews and Arabs claim Abraham as their forefather and see the land of Canaan as part of their heritage. The heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict is the claim to the land of Israel, which both sides consider their rightful homeland. For Jews, the land is not just a place to live, it's a fulfillment of a divine promise. God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob includes the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel and Palestine, as an everlasting inheritance for their descendants. Genesis 15:18-21. This promise is reaffirmed throughout the Old Testament, particularly in God's covenants with Moses and King David. The Bible also speaks of the restoration of Israel in the end times, with prophecies in Ezekiel 37 and Isaiah 66 describing a future where Israel is regathered from exile and restored to its land. These prophecies were seen by many as being fulfilled in 1948, when Israel became a nation after nearly 2,000 years of exile, following the horrors of the Holocaust. For Palestinians, many of whom trace their lineage to Ishmael and view themselves as descendants of the ancient Canaanites and other peoples of the region, the land is their ancestral home as well. They have lived in the region for centuries, and their connection to the land runs deep. This tension over land ownership creates a complex and emotionally charged dispute that goes beyond mere politics. It touches on identity, faith, and historical rights. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 marks one of the most pivotal and controversial moments in modern Middle Eastern history. It was a moment of jubilation for the Jewish people, symbolizing the fulfillment of ancient prophecies and the restoration of their homeland after centuries of exile. But for Palestinians, this moment signified the beginning of an enduring displacement and loss, sparking what they call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Understanding the profound impact of 1948 requires a deep dive into the historical, political, and emotional elements that have shaped the Israel-Palestine conflict as we know it today. To grasp the significance of 1948, we must first understand the factors that led to the creation of the State of Israel. The modern conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine began to take shape in the late 19th century with the rise of the Zionist movement, founded by Theodor Herzl In 1897, Zionism advocated for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in response to centuries of persecution, including pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia. Palestine at that time was under Ottoman control and home to a predominantly Arab Muslim population with smaller Christian and Jewish communities. However, the Zionist movement viewed Palestine as the historic homeland of the Jewish people, based on biblical claims and historical ties to the land of Israel. From the early 1900s, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased steadily, fueled by Zionist aspirations and the growing dangers Jews faced in Europe. This immigration was further accelerated by the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British government expressed its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The declaration, while welcomed by Jews, sowed the seeds of conflict with the Arab inhabitants of the region. They viewed the declaration as a betrayal by the British, who had previously promised Arab independence in exchange for support against the Ottoman Empire during World War I. After the defeat of the Ottomans in 1918, Britain was given control over Palestine under a League of Nations mandate, a move that formalized its role in administering the region. During this period, Jewish immigration and land purchases continued to increase, resulting in growing tensions between Jews and Arabs. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, these tensions escalated into sporadic violence between Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine. Both groups felt a deep attachment to the land, and the competing nationalist movements, Zionism for Jews and Arab nationalism for Palestinians, began to clash more openly. In the 1930s, as Jewish immigration surged, particularly due to the rise of Nazi Germany, Palestinian Arabs grew increasingly alarmed. Many Palestinians feared that the growing Jewish population would soon dominate the land, leading to calls for limits on immigration and Jewish land purchases. These fears reached a boiling point during the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, a widespread uprising against both the British administration and Jewish communities. The revolt was violently suppressed by the British, but it deepened Palestinian resentment and strengthened the Jewish community's desire for self-defense. The tragic events of World War II and the Holocaust added urgency to the Zionist cause. The systematic extermination of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany left the surviving Jewish population determined to create a homeland where they could live safely and free from persecution. For many Jews, Palestine was the only place that could serve as this refuge. After the war, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees, many of them Holocaust survivors, sought to immigrate to Palestine. However, the British, facing increasing Arab opposition and their own geopolitical challenges, imposed limits on Jewish immigration. This led to Jewish paramilitary organizations like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi launching violent campaigns against British forces, demanding an end to immigration restrictions and British rule. The British, exhausted from the war and unable to manage the growing violence, referred the issue of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations in 1947. In response to the rising violence between Jews and Arabs, the United Nations proposed a solution, the Partition Plan of 1947. The plan aimed to divide Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem placed under international administration due to its religious significance to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. According to the UN Partition Plan, 55% of the land would be allocated to the Jewish state, 45% of the land would go to the Arab state. Jerusalem would remain under international control. To the Palestinians, the UN partition plan of 1947 wasn't just a political disappointment, it was a national catastrophe, known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. This moment marked the beginning of widespread displacement. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced to flee or were expelled from their homes during the war that followed Israel's declaration of independence in 1948. From their perspective, a foreign solution had divided their homeland, granting the majority of the land to a minority population, many of whom had only recently arrived from Europe, fleeing persecution. The wounds of that event are still raw today, passed down from generation to generation as a deep sense of loss, injustice, and unresolved identity. Meanwhile, for the Jewish people, Israel's rebirth was nothing short of a miracle, a prophetic fulfillment after centuries of exile, persecution, and the horrors of the Holocaust. They saw it as a return to their ancestral homeland, a safe haven granted by divine promise and historical right. But with that return came immediate conflict, as Arab nations launched attacks in what became Israel's War of Independence. So from the very beginning, both peoples carried a story of suffering, survival, and a sense of divine destiny. But those stories collided on the same piece of land. What one side saw as redemption, the other experienced as devastation. This deep and emotional divide didn't begin in 1947, but that moment crystallized what had been building for centuries, biblical tensions taking form in modern political realities. And the ripple effects of that day are still shaping every conversation about peace, justice, and identity in the region. Yet, the plan gave them a majority of the territory, including some areas with large Arab populations. The Arab leadership rejected the partition plan outright, viewing it as a colonialist imposition that violated the rights of the indigenous Arab population. They believed that all of Palestine should be an Arab state, and that the growing Jewish presence was an illegitimate colonization project. Jewish leaders, led by David Ben-Gurion, accepted the plan with reservations, seeing it as the best opportunity to achieve statehood, even though it did not give them control over Jerusalem. On May 14, 1948, as the British mandate in Palestine came to an end, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The next day, armies from 5 neighboring Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, invaded the new state, aiming to crush it before it could take root. This was the beginning of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, known in Israel as the War of Independence, and to Palestinians as the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe. While Israel fought for its survival, the consequences for the Palestinians were devastating. During the war, over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, either fleeing their homes out of fear or being forcibly expelled by Israeli forces. Entire Palestinian villages were depopulated, and many were razed to the ground. These refugees fled to neighboring countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, or to the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The causes of this mass displacement are still hotly debated. Israeli historians argue that many Palestinians fled voluntarily, anticipating a swift Arab victory, while Palestinian scholars emphasize the expulsions carried out by Jewish militias during military campaigns, such as Pont Dielet, which aimed to secure the borders of the new state. Regardless of the causes, the result was the same: an enormous population of stateless Palestinians and a deep sense of injustice that has fueled the conflict for decades. The 1949 armistice agreements, which ended the war, left Israel in control of 78% of historic Palestine. The remaining territories, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, were controlled by Jordan and Egypt, respectively, until the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel captured these areas. The Nakba is not just a historical event for Palestinians. It is the defining trauma of their national identity. The displacement of 1948 created a Palestinian refugee crisis that persists to this day, with millions of Palestinians living in refugee camps in neighboring Arab countries, in the West Bank and Gaza, or scattered across the globe. The right of return, the demand that Palestinian refugees and their descendants be allowed to return to the homes they fled or were expelled from in 1948, remains one of the core issues of the Israel-Palestine conflict. For Palestinians, 1948 represents the loss of their homeland, the destruction of their society, and the beginning of their statelessness. Every year, on May 15th, Palestinians commemorate Nakba Day, mourning the loss of their land and demanding recognition of their rights. The memory of the Nakba is a source of deep resentment and fuels the desire for justice, restitution, and statehood. The events of 1948 laid the foundation for the modern Israel-Palestine conflict. The establishment of Israel and the displacement of the Palestinian people created two opposing national narratives, one of triumph and restoration for Jews, and one of catastrophe and dispossession for Palestinians. These competing historical memories have shaped the collective identities of both peoples and have made the path to peace extraordinarily difficult. The Nakba remains at the heart of the Palestinian demand for self-determination, justice, and the right of return. While for Israelis, the War of 1948 symbolizes the fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old dream to return to their ancestral homeland and build a sovereign state. The legacy of 1948 continues to cast a long shadow over every attempt to resolve the conflict, with both sides seeing the events of that year as critical to understanding their present-day struggles. The Six-Day War of 1967 is one of the most decisive and transformative events in the modern Middle East, reshaping the geopolitical landscape of the region and laying the groundwork for the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict. For Israel, the war resulted in a swift, overwhelming victory that expanded its territory and solidified its position in the region. For the Palestinians and neighboring Arab states, the war marked the beginning of an extended Israeli occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, and Golan Heights, a source of enduring conflict and international tension. The consequences of this brief but intense war have reverberated throughout the decades, influencing the political, social, and spiritual dimensions of the conflict. Understanding the Six-Day War and its aftermath is crucial to comprehending the roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict, as it fundamentally changed the landscape of the region and cemented issues that remain central today. The Six-Day War did not arise out of a vacuum, but was the culmination of escalating tensions between Israel and its neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, following the creation of Israel in 1948. These tensions were heightened by several key factors. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, known to Israelis as the War of Independence and to Palestinians as the Nakba catastrophe, had left deep scars. Arab states, particularly Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, refused to recognize Israel's right to exist and remained committed to reversing the outcomes of 1948. Arab nationalism, spearheaded by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, aimed at uniting Arab states against Israel. The 1948 war left unresolved territorial disputes, particularly over the West Bank, controlled by Jordan, Gaza, controlled by Egypt, and the Golan Heights, part of Syria. In the years leading up to the Six-Day War, there were frequent skirmishes and border clashes between Israel and its neighbors, with tensions growing over control of these areas. Another precursor to the Six-Day War was the Suez Crisis of 1956, in which Israel, in coordination with Britain and France, invaded Egypt following Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. Although Israel withdrew under international pressure, the war deepened animosity between Israel and Egypt and laid the groundwork for future conflict. The Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union also played a role. The Arab states, particularly Egypt and Syria, were supported by the Soviet Union, while Israel, despite receiving international arms and economic support from various countries, increasingly became aligned with the United States and Western powers. In May 1967, Nasser escalated the conflict by closing the Straits of Tehran to Israeli shipping, effectively blockading Israel's port of Eilat and cutting off vital maritime access to the Red Sea. Israel viewed this as an act of war, and international efforts to mediate the situation failed, faced with increasing threats from its neighbors, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, and the military mobilization of Arab forces along its borders. Israel felt surrounded and vulnerable. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, marking the start of the Six-Day War. Israel's Air Force led the offensive, launching Operation Focus, a meticulously planned surprise attack that destroyed the majority of Egypt's air force while it was still on the ground. This left Egypt's military crippled and ensured Israel's air superiority throughout the conflict. Over the next 6 days, Israel fought on multiple fronts against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, achieving stunning victories. By the end of the war on June 10, 1967, Israel had achieved the following: captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, seized control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, captured the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel had tripled the size of its territory in just 6 days, changing the region's political map dramatically. The capture of East Jerusalem, including the Old City and sites sacred to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, had profound religious and political significance. The victory was celebrated in Israel as a miracle, cementing the state's military prowess in the region. The Six-Day War created a new reality. Israel now controlled significant Arab populations in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, beginning what is known as the Israeli occupation of these territories. Israel's capture of the West Bank and Gaza brought over 1 million Palestinians under Israeli military rule. This occupation has been one of the most contentious issues in the Israel-Palestine conflict, as Palestinians in these territories seek independence and the establishment of a Palestinian state. The occupation remains a point of deep international concern, particularly with the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. The capture of East Jerusalem and its unification with West Jerusalem was perhaps the most symbolic victory for Israel. The Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, came under Israeli control for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. However, for Palestinians and the broader Arab world, the loss of East Jerusalem was a major blow, as the city is also home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, two of the holiest sites in Islam. The capture of the Golan Heights from Syria has remained a strategic military advantage for Israel, providing a buffer zone against potential attacks from the north. However, the Syrian government continues to demand its return, making the Golan a key point of contention in Israeli-Syrian relations. The war exacerbated the Palestinian refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were displaced from the newly occupied territories, adding to the already significant number of refugees created during the 1948 Nakba. These displaced Palestinians have never been allowed to return, fueling resentment and further complicating peace efforts. Israel's victory in the Six-Day War was a result of not only its military strategy, but also the support and backing of various international allies. While Israel's primary military backer was the United States, other Western countries played key roles in providing funding, weapons, and diplomatic backing. Although the U.S. did not directly engage in the Six-Day War, it provided critical military and financial support to Israel in the lead-up to the conflict. U.S. policy in the Middle East during the 1960s was shaped by the Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union. With the Soviet Union backing Arab states like Egypt and Syria, the U.S. saw Israel as a strategic ally in the region. The U.S. provides Israel with a wide array of military equipment, including aircraft, tanks, and artillery, as well as financial aid. The Israeli Air Force, which played a decisive role in the war, was equipped with American-made aircraft, including the French Mirage jets and American F-4 Phantom jets. The U.S. also provided diplomatic cover for Israel at the United Nations. While the U.S. called for a ceasefire during the war, it did not prevent Israel from achieving its objectives. Prior to the Six-Day War, France was Israel's most important arms supplier. France played a significant role in building Israel's military capabilities during the 1950s and early 1960s, including selling Mirage III fighter jets, which were pivotal in achieving Israel's air superiority. However, following the war, France distanced itself from Israel, aligning more with Arab states. Significant funding for Israel's military efforts also came from private Jewish organizations and diaspora communities around the world, particularly in the United States. Jewish communities raised money to help fund military equipment, humanitarian aid, and infrastructure for the new Israeli state. On the opposite side, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan were heavily backed by the Soviet Union, which supplied them with military training, arms, and financial assistance. The Soviet Union saw the Arab states as strategic partners in the Cold War, struggle for influence in the Middle East, and provided tanks, aircraft, and artillery to Arab forces. Despite this support, Arab military coordination was poor, and their forces were quickly overwhelmed by Israel's preemptive strike and superior military planning. The Six-Day War transformed the Middle East. Israel had not only secured its survival, but had expanded its borders significantly. However, the occupation of Palestinian territories, including the West Bank and Gaza, laid the foundation for decades of tension, uprisings, and cycles of violence. UN Resolution 242. Following the war, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 242, which called for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict and for the recognition of every state in the area to live in peace. While the resolution became the basis for future peace negotiations, its ambiguous wording, especially regarding the extent of Israeli withdrawal, left it open to multiple interpretations. To this day, the status of the occupied territories remains a central issue in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Settlement movement. In the aftermath of the war, Israeli settlements began to sprout in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. These settlements, viewed by the international community as illegal under international law, have expanded significantly over the decades, creating a demographic and political reality that complicates any potential for a two-state solution. Palestinian resistance. The Six-Day War also catalyzed Palestinian nationalism with the rise of movements like Fatah and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat. These groups increasingly demanded the establishment of an independent Palestinian state and used both political means and armed struggle to achieve their goals. The occupation became a source of daily hardship for Palestinians and a rallying cry for resistance movements. The Six-Day War is more than just a military conflict. It's the event that reshaped the modern Middle East and defined the parameters of the Israel-Palestine conflict that persists today. Israel's rapid victory and subsequent occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem set the stage for decades of tension, resistance, and cycles of violence. The consequences of the war occupation, displacement, settlement expansion, and the continuing struggle for Jerusalem remain at the heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict, with both sides deeply entrenched in their positions. As we consider the events of 1967, it becomes clear that the Six-Day War was not just a flashpoint in history, but the moment that fundamentally altered the future of the Middle East. At the heart of the spiritual view of the Israel-Palestine conflict is the covenant that God made with Abraham, and, by extension, with his descendants. This covenant is not only about the people of Israel, but also about a specific piece of land, the land of Canaan, which God promised to Abraham's descendants as an everlasting inheritance. In Genesis 12:1-3, God promises Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. To your offspring, I will give this land." This divine promise of land is reiterated in Genesis 15:18-21, where God specifies the boundaries of this land, stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. It was given to Abraham's descendants through Isaac, not as a temporary possession, but as an everlasting possession. Genesis 17:7-8. This promise forms the foundation of Jewish claims to the land of Israel and Jerusalem, as they see themselves as the heirs of this covenant. For many Christians, this covenant remains active and significant in the modern era. The belief is that God's promises are eternal, and that the land of Israel was given to the Jewish people as part of his divine plan. Thus, any conflict over this land is not just about politics or territory. It's seen as an attempt to undermine God's covenant and thwart his plan for Israel and the world. Throughout the Old Testament, there are numerous prophecies about the scattering of the Jewish people, their exile, and their eventual restoration to the land of Israel. These prophecies speak of a time when Israel would be regathered from the nations and restored to their homeland, a process that many Christians believe began in the 20th century. One of the most significant prophecies comes from the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 37, the prophet has a vision of a valley filled with dry bones, which represent the people of Israel. God tells Ezekiel that these bones will be brought back to life, a metaphor for the resurrection of the nation of Israel after centuries of exile. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Ezekiel 37:5-6. To the Palestinians, the UN partition plan of 1947 wasn't just a political disappointment, it was a national catastrophe, known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. This moment marked the beginning of widespread displacement. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced to flee or were expelled from their homes during the war that followed Israel's declaration of independence in 1948. From their perspective, a foreign solution had divided their homeland, granting the majority of the land to a minority population, many of whom had only recently arrived from Europe, fleeing persecution. The wounds of that event are still raw today, passed down from generation to generation as a deep sense of loss, injustice, and unresolved identity. Meanwhile, for the Jewish people, Israel's rebirth was nothing short of a miracle, a prophetic fulfillment after centuries of exile, persecution, and the horrors of the Holocaust. They saw it as a return to their ancestral homeland, a safe haven granted by divine promise and historical right. But with that return came immediate conflict, as Arab nations launched attacks in what became Israel's War of Independence. So from the very beginning, both peoples carried a story of suffering, survival, and a sense of divine destiny. But those stories collided on the same piece of land. What one side saw as redemption, the other experienced as devastation. And that's the heart of the matter. What we see today is not just a political standoff or a territorial dispute. It's the visible surface of a much deeper, ancient spiritual fracture. A fracture that began in the tents of Abraham, echoed through the prophets, and now plays out in news headlines, diplomatic meetings, and battles over sacred ground. Jerusalem stands at the center of it all, not just geographically, but spiritually. For Jews, it is the eternal capital promised by God. For Muslims, it is the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest place in Islam. And for Christians, it is the city where Jesus was crucified, buried, and rose again. 3 faiths, 1 city, and yet no lasting peace. The Bible foretold that this land would be a cup of trembling for all nations. Zechariah 12:2. We are watching that prophecy unfold before our very eyes. Political leaders seek solutions. Treaties are drafted and broken, and global powers get involved. But none seem able to untangle the spiritual knots tied thousands of years ago. And that's why, as believers, we must look beyond human strategies and seek divine understanding. This is not merely a matter of borders. It's a clash of covenants, destinies, and spiritual legacies. The question isn't just who owns the land, but what does God say about it? In the coming segments, we'll break down what the Bible says about the future of Israel, the role of the nations, and how all of this may be setting the stage for the return of the King. Stay tuned. After nearly 2,000 years of exile, following the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, the Jewish people were regathered to their ancient homeland, just as the Bible foretold. This was seen as a miraculous event, one that signaled the beginning of the end times timeline. If Israel is central to God's prophetic plan, then Jerusalem is the crown jewel of that plan. The city of Jerusalem holds unparalleled significance in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But its biblical importance is especially highlighted in prophecy. Jerusalem is described as the city where God has placed his name and where he will dwell with his people. In the 2 Chronicles 6, God says, "But now I have chosen Jerusalem for my name to be there, and I have chosen David to rule my people Israel." Throughout the Bible, Jerusalem is depicted as the focal point of God's activity on earth. It's the place where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac, where David established his kingdom, and where Solomon's temple stood as a symbol of God's presence among his people. In the New Testament, Jerusalem is the city where Jesus Christ was crucified and resurrected, making it central to the Christian faith as well. However, Jerusalem's role in prophecy extends beyond these historical events. The book of Zechariah speaks of Jerusalem's future role in the end times. In Zechariah 12:1-3, God declares that Jerusalem will become a source of conflict and global tension in the last days. "I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged, as well as Jerusalem. On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves." This prophecy foretells a time when nations will rise up against Israel and attempt to take control of Jerusalem. But they will ultimately fail. For many Christians, the modern conflict over Jerusalem, its status as a divided city, claimed by both Israelis and Palestinians, is a direct fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy. The tension surrounding Jerusalem's status remains a key issue in the Israel-Palestine conflict, with both sides claiming it as their capital. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel captured East Jerusalem, including the Old City, bringing the entire city under Israeli control for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. This event is viewed by many Christians as part of the prophetic restoration of Israel, as it brought the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, back into Jewish hands. However, it also intensified the conflict with Palestinians, who see East Jerusalem as the capital of their future state. The Bible speaks of Jerusalem's central role in the final battles of the end times. The book of Revelation and other apocalyptic texts describe a series of wars and conflicts that will culminate in Armageddon, the ultimate confrontation between the forces of good and evil. According to these prophecies, Jerusalem will be the epicenter of these final battles. In Revelation 16:16, it is written, "Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon." Armageddon, derived from the Hebrew ha-Megiddo, refers to a valley near Jerusalem, which is traditionally viewed as the location of the final battle between the Antichrist and the forces of God. In this battle, Jerusalem will play a critical role as the city of God, where Christ will ultimately return to defeat his enemies and establish his millennial kingdom. The book of Zechariah also speaks of this final confrontation. "Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem." Zechariah 14:3-4. For Christians who view the Israel-Palestine conflict through a prophetic lens, the ongoing struggle over Jerusalem is a sign that these end-time events are drawing near. The battle for control over the city is seen as more than just a territorial dispute. It is part of a cosmic spiritual war between the forces of good and with the city, at the heart of God's plan for the final redemption of the world. For many Christians and Jews who interpret the Israel-Palestine conflict as part of biblical prophecy, the war over the land is more than just a human conflict. It is a spiritual battle. According to this view, Satan seeks to destroy Israel and thwart God's plans for his chosen people. The rise of opposition to Israel, whether from Palestinian groups surrounding Arab nations or international critics, is often seen as part of this larger spiritual warfare. In the book of Daniel, for instance, we read about spiritual forces influencing earthly rulers and conflicts. Daniel speaks of angelic beings battling the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, spiritual forces that represent the earthly powers of those nations. Many believe that similar spiritual forces are at work in the modern conflict over Israel, with demonic powers attempting to undermine God's purposes. Furthermore, the conflict over Jerusalem is seen as a microcosm of the larger spiritual battle between God's kingdom and the forces of darkness. For Christians, this struggle is not just about national sovereignty or political boundaries. It's about the culmination of God's plan to redeem the world through Christ, who will return to rule from Jerusalem and establish his eternal kingdom. The city of Jerusalem, with its profound religious significance, remains at the center of the political struggle. Israel's control over East Jerusalem, which Palestinians claim as the capital of their future state, has been a major sticking point in peace talks. The international community, including the United Nations, has not recognized Israeli sovereignty over East Jerusalem, viewing it as occupied territory. The two-state solution, which envisions an independent state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel, remains the most widely proposed solution to the conflict. And that larger story is not just about two peoples or two states. It's about a divine timeline, a spiritual narrative written long before modern borders existed. The Bible doesn't shy away from conflict, it reveals it. It tells us that, in the last days, Jerusalem will become a burdensome stone for all nations. Zechariah 12:3, and the nations of the earth will gather against it. We're not just witnessing a regional dispute, we're watching prophecy in motion. This is why every headline, every peace summit, every flare-up of violence in the region should cause us to pause not in fear, but in awareness. Because what happens in this tiny strip of land has global significance. It's the spiritual epicenter of the world, the battleground between God's eternal purposes and human rebellion. For believers, this isn't just a call to pay attention, it's a call to action, not political action, but spiritual readiness, to watch, to pray, and to anchor ourselves in the Word of God. Because the story of Israel and Palestine is ultimately not just about history or politics, it's about redemption. It's about God fulfilling his promises to his people and preparing the world for what comes next. So, as we continue this journey through Scripture, prophecy, and current events, remember, this isn't just about understanding the past. It's about preparing for the future. Your voice matters because this conversation isn't just for scholars or world leaders. It's for all of us, seeking to understand the times we're living in. Whether you believe this is a spiritual battle, a political struggle, or both woven together, one thing is certain: the Israel-Palestine conflict touches something deep within the human story and within God's redemptive plan for the nations. So what do you think? Could this ancient feud be the key to unlocking end-time prophecy? Or is it simply a tragic result of human division and historical wounds? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you, your insights, your questions, even your doubts. And if today's video helped you see this conflict in a new light, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Deep Bible Studies for more powerful insights into how Scripture, history, and current events collide. The story isn't over yet, and we'll be here to explore it with you, one revelation at a time.